Okay, let's dive right into this. Today, we are unlocking one of the most widely read, deeply analyzed, and literally world-changing historical documents ever assembled, the Gospel of Matthew. In this explainer, we aren't just doing a surface reading of the text. Instead, we're popping the hood and looking at the mechanics of the text itself. We're going to explore exactly how this incredibly structured book was put together, the intense historical tensions surrounding its creation, and of course, the fascinating introduction of the man credited with actually writing it.
So I want you to think about this question for a second. If you were launching a movement that was destined to span the globe, who would you commission to write your foundational document? A beloved leader? A revered scholar? Well, what's incredibly ironic about the Gospel of Matthew is that nowhere in these four Gospels do we find a single recorded word that the author, Matthew, actually spoke. Think about that. He never quotes himself. He remains completely silent in the shadows of the narrative. So who exactly was this silent author?
Section 1. The Hated Tax Collector. To understand the author, we have to look at the extreme, despised margins of ancient society.
The man known as Matthew, whose old name was Levi, was a native of Capernaum, and he worked a job that made him universally hated by his own neighbors. He was a tax collector, or a publican. Now, in Jewish society back then, these guys were among the most despised people alive. Why? Well, they essentially sold themselves out to be occupying Roman government. They purchased the right to gather taxes from their own people, and the kicker is, the more they gathered, the more they personally kept. Imagine the modern IRS, but legally incentivized to squeeze you for their own personal profit. They were viewed as outright traitors, as thieves, and because they were constantly dealing with Gentiles, they were seen as religiously unclean.
But guys, there is a massive historical irony here. The 19th century Scottish preacher Alexander White once famously noted that when Matthew left his job to follow Christ, he brought his pen with him. It's brilliant. Matthew's highly despised profession required rigorous, meticulous, and systematic record-keeping, and that exact specific skill set perfectly positioned him to organize and systematically write down the complex teachings and narratives that make up this gospel. His greatest social liability literally became his greatest literary asset. Understanding this completely changes how we read the text today. Which brings us to Section 2, Bridging Two Testaments. Matthew wasn't just writing a story. Scholars note his primary function was acting as a bridge builder. Think about it like this. If a reader were to jump straight from the end of the ancient Hebrew scriptures right into the letters of the New Testament, they'd be completely lost. Matthew's text is the deliberate bridge connecting a brand new era to ancient history. The source text points out a really sharp thematic contrast here. The Old Testament begins by outlining the history of the generations of Adam, a history marked by a repeated phrase that sounds almost like a tolling funeral bell, and he died. It's a narrative heavily marked by death. But Matthew? He opens his gospel with the book of the generation of Jesus Christ. He is deliberately shifting the reader out of a history of death and into a brand new narrative characterized by birth and life. Now, to build this bridge successfully, Matthew had to emphatically prove his case to his primary audience, Jewish readers. Get a load of this staggering number. 129. That is the number of Old Testament quotations and allusions that Matthew wove directly into his gospel. He systematically layers these ancient references to prove his central thesis beyond a shadow of a doubt. And to cement those 129 references, he leans heavily on one specific keyword, fulfilled. He drops this word roughly 15 times throughout the text. It acts as a mechanical literary anchor. Whether it's a birth in Bethlehem, a flight to Egypt, or relocating to Nazareth, Matthew's central literary purpose is to clearly connect those ancient promises to the new events of his biography. He is meticulously, carefully linking the old with the new. Section 3. Blueprint of the King. Now, how exactly did he arrange all of this material? It's absolutely crucial to understand that none of the ancient Gospels are biographies in the modern chronological sense. They aren't strictly day-by-day diaries. Instead, Matthew's document is a highly organized, topically arranged blueprint. Just take a look at how this content breaks down. At least 60% of the Gospel of Matthew focuses entirely on teachings rather than narrative action. It is heavily, heavily weighted toward instruction. In many ways, this was designed to be a comprehensive training manual for its readers. And the way he structured it perfectly illustrates the ex-tax collector's systematic mind. He alternates topically between blocks of doing and blocks of teaching. He does this 5 distinct times. First, you get a narrative block, then an instructional block, followed immediately by a transition phrase like, when Jesus had ended these sayings. For instance, in chapters 8 and 9, he groups 10 miracles together, completely ignoring the actual historical sequence, just so he can group the topics together logically. It's incredibly deliberate.
So, why 5 sections? Well, many commentators and scholars point out that Matthew purposefully grouped these teachings into exactly 5 major discourses to parallel the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch. By doing this, Matthew is brilliantly presenting his text as a new foundational manual, portraying Jesus as providing a new standard of teaching right in line with their most ancient and revered texts.
Section 4. Building a New People. This structured manual ultimately leads us to the theological heart of the text. Matthew wasn't just recording history. He was actively redefining who actually belonged to this new movement. He is the only gospel writer to use the Greek word ecclesia, which translates to church, or a called-out assembly. Now, in the ancient Hebrew texts, the called-out people referred exclusively to the single nation of Israel, but Matthew redefines it. He uses it to describe a totally new, diverse assembly that breaks completely out of a single ethnic or national identity. Because even though Matthew was writing primarily for a Jewish audience, he weaves this shockingly universal thread right through his manual. Think about it. He includes stories of Gentile leaders worshiping the infant, miracles performed specifically for outsiders, high praise for the Gentile Queen of Sheba, and he ends the whole thing with a sweeping final commission to go to all nations. He is deliberately using his text to break down the rigid racial and social exclusiveness of his era.
Section 5. The historical context. Let's take a step back and look at the scholarly debate regarding exactly when, where, and how this masterpiece was actually assembled. Tracing the widely held scholarly consensus, the historical events of Jesus' life occurred around AD 30. Then, decades later, around AD 64 or later, the Gospel of Mark starts circulating widely. Most scholars agree that Matthew, writing somewhere between AD 70 and AD 90, likely in the Syria-Palestine region, relied heavily on Mark's earlier text. Right in line with the literary practices of the day, he used Mark as a source, but then carefully wove in his own unique, highly structured material around it.
And the reason he wrote it during this specific AD 70 to 90 window is absolutely key. This was a time of massive local tension. The temple in Jerusalem had just been destroyed. Matthew was addressing the intense needs of early Jewish Christians who were increasingly conflicting with an emerging Pharisaic rabbinic movement in Syria-Palestine. His highly organized manual was practically written to equip his specific local community with the tools they needed to survive and navigate this intense cultural and religious shift. Which leaves us with this final, genuinely remarkable question. How did a text designed to address a highly specific local conflict between first-century religious groups in the Eastern Mediterranean become a foundational document that now spans the globe? The unlikely scribe, a formerly hated tax collector, took his meticulous record-keeping skills and built a bridge that stepped totally out of local history and invited all nations into the narrative. It is an incredible transformation of a text and definitely something worth thinking about. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.